So I'm Joshua Cohen. I'm the community director at Partners for Climate Action, Hudson Valley, where we support ecological leadership across the Hudson Valley by deploying capital in its many forms to support local equitable solutions. I also direct the Hudson Valley Climate Action Network, or HVCAN. Many of you are members. And HVCAN is a community of grassroots leaders, nonprofits, educators, policymakers, and businesses leading together on climate action. If you're not a member of HVCAN, please join us. It's free to register at hvcan.org. So thanks again for joining this morning. This is our second morning coffee session. Let me just admit a couple more folks here. And these are intended as peer-to-peer learning opportunities to build community and share knowledge. So I'm glad that you're all here with us today because we have a really interesting speaker, Dr. Anton Seimon. But before we introduce him, I'd like to let you know that today he's going to give an overview of his work. We will have a moderated Q&A session with Bob Dandrew, my colleague, Partners for Climate Action, and then we'll have an open sort of audience Q&A. So if you have questions that you'd like to share throughout the session, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll also have an opportunity later to ask questions either in the chat or you can raise your virtual hand as well if you have one when it's that time. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't mind keeping yourself on mute for most of the session until the Q&A, we would appreciate that. And I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague, Bob Dandrew, to introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. And hello, everybody. I have to say, it was such an encouraging sign when we sent this invitation out. There was a huge response, and we actually had to change our license with Zoom to allow for more participants on the call. So I think that shows a number of things, not the least of which is the fact there are so many of us who care about what's happening right now with the climate and just the kind of the bioregion in general. So we're very grateful. Anton. Somebody else needs to put themselves on mute. Great. Oops. Okay, I don't quite know what to do about that, Joshua, but I'll just keep talking and hopefully they'll shut up. So let me tell you about Anton Seimon. He is an atmospheric scientist, and he has huge experience in meteorological and climatological research. He's a National Geographic Explorer, which I think is kind of cool. He's a research scholar with Bard College's Center for Environmental Policy. And one of his specialties is tornado research. So I expect to hear about some of that. Actually, I have a question.
You're not hearing it? Like, enough. Hey, people can go to the concert. Not.
All right. So Anton is a multi-year veteran of chasing storms in Tornado Alley. He spends, I think, every spring in the Great Plains of this country with his wife, Tracy, who's also a scientist and who's also on this Zoom call with us. And when he's not roaming the plains, seeking out elusive masses of rotating water and vapor, he coordinates long-term monitoring of climate change impacts in the Andes, kind of the high alpine watershed. He studies present and past tropical Andean climate, and he works with conservationists to plan for climate change in Africa using high-resolution Earth system models. But lucky for us, he lives in Columbia County, and he's spent decades observing our weather here, storm phenomena in particular. So that's what he's here to tell us about. Anton, I'm going to turn it to you for kind of an overview, and then I'll step in after when you're ready. And I've got some questions to kick us off, and then again, we'll be looking to the group's questions in the chat. So everybody join me in welcoming Anton Seimon.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Bob and Joshua. It's great pleasure and privilege to be here. Perched above the Hudson Valley, I'm up in Canaan, the northeast corner of Columbia County, where we have a magnificent view looking out from the top of Mercer Mountain here across the valley. And why don't we share some of the local bucolics, because the recent storms have really graced us. And it's just magnificent up here, but it's also a bit problematic. So those trees are very heavily laden with ice and snow here on the mountaintop. And tomorrow night, we may have another ice storm. And there could be a lot of tree damage. And guess what? It's somewhat apropos to the discussion today, because we are talking about climate damages, storm damages, things like that. And huge questions exist about what are the prospects for the future in places like the Hudson Valley under climate change. I mean, everywhere in the world, everywhere is affected. No place is not going to be affected by climate change or already being affected. We see that it's just more discernible in some places than others. And there's this inevitable inclination that we have, and certainly the media has, to try to tie absolutely every weather event to climate change now. That's somewhat disingenuous, because weather's always happened, storms have always happened, and they will continue to happen. Whether climate change makes them worse or less bad is a very challenging question that a great deal of scientific attention is focused on right now. And we have some pretty interesting tools that help us actually discern, the level of attribution. We can say that human caused climate change may have made a particular system worse. For example, the recent floods in California getting a great deal of attention. Is that climate change? Well, we know historically, certainly in the early 1860s, there was an event that was actually far worse before the buildup of greenhouse gases was significant. So, well, that obviously wasn't, human-induced climate change in the 1860s. So why should we believe the current one is? So there are lots of open questions like that. And during the course of the next hour, I hope that we're able to touch on some things. Very keen to receive your questions. But I'll give it a little bit about my background and how I got so fascinated with, weather and the weather in this particular part of the world, which is really dramatic. And one of the great joys to me about living in the Hudson Valley region is the drama of the weather, the cycle of weather that we go through on an almost daily basis here. Things are always changing. It's very rare that we actually get a stagnant spell. Maybe in the middle of summer, kind of feel like you're in the doldrums where one day is not really discernible from the other. One of the things that Tracy and I do is we take a daily walk with our hound and dog through the woods, the same walk pretty much every day. And one of the things you really appreciate when you do that, taking a walk through the woods, is you see all the natural changes that take place on the annual cycle. And you also see things that are anomalous, which are really interesting. And some of them are a little disturbing. Sense, for example, that, the winter season is shortening on both sides. Spring occurs earlier. We hear those spring peeper frogs in the middle of March now. That used to be an April phenomenon, right? Sometimes we've even heard them at the end of February. Really, really kind of crazy. And then the leaf drop seems to be progressing later and later into the fall. These are discernible changes. And, when they go sort of gradually, you may not really notice them. But if you pull out some pictures, say, from Halloween, from your childhood, you may be surprised to find that the leaves have already fallen off the trees, okay? That never occurs now, okay? Well, depending where you are, like this far north, sure, the leaves may be off the trees. But down in Westchester County, where I went to high school, forget about it, the leaves are never off the trees now, but they were always off the trees back in the 1980s when I was in school. So there are things like that which are already discernible, and we'll talk about this morning. But then the question of the storms themselves, something of obviously of enduring fascination to me and probably many of you. As I began to study storms in the Northeast, found some unusual things that I would never have guessed at. For example, the east side of the Hudson Valley, it turns out, because of some very local characteristics, actually is a favored corridor for tornado activity. Now, tornadoes don't occur frequently enough that that's sort of something that should keep you awake at night. But once a decade, there's something pretty significant that occurs here, all right? And in 1995, a monster tornado occurred and moved through the south side of Great Barrington. Many of you probably know about that event. That tornado was as strong and large as the upper end storms that you get in the central United States, the one that make all the news. It plowed through forests, totally leveled things. A corridor more than half a mile wide, plowed right across the Taconic Parkway near Hillsdale. Every tree mowed down. You could see it for many years afterwards. And now the trees have grown back and we kind of forget, but it will happen again. And that's really an interesting thing. So that's one of the things that kind of got me into tornado research in the first place. Having, I was living in Albany back then, almost drove into that storm. It was just a point of enduring fascination. So really, I study storms all over the world, but what happens here locally is of particular interest and great drama. And there's some historic storms which are now lost from memory to most of us. I only know about them because I read old newspaper accounts and read old meteorological journals and things like that. But anyone who was around in 1950 would have been aware of the Great Appalachian Storm that occurred over Thanksgiving, when probably something like, a significant fraction of the trees in the Northeast United States were blown over. Okay, one windstorm, unbelievable windstorm. Wasn't a hurricane, it was a winter type storm. Strongest winds on record in places like Albany and New York City and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 110 miles an hour in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 108 miles an hour in Newark. Unbelievable. So that was 1950, and they haven't seen a storm of that magnitude since. If it was to recur, and it will recur, of course, it's very hard to not say, oh, climate change did it. But having that historical perspective is very, very informative as well. So teasing out what is natural and what is human augmented, you might say, not necessarily human caused, but human augmented, is an interesting challenge. So why don't we leave it at that? Bob's prepared some questions for me, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anton. Yeah, so one of the questions I've been really looking forward to asking you is both how you got into tornado research, but also, more importantly, why? What attracted you to that?
Well, I've related a little bit of that, but part of the, it's an interesting story, and my origin story is that I grew up very far away from here in South Africa, hence the strange accent, where the weather was incredibly lovely and very, very boring from my perspective, on the Indian Ocean coast in the city of Durban. There was a childhood memory, though. We were up the coast one day as a family, and there was a great storm blew in. The word is my dad saw a vortex like a tornado, and we heroically hunkered down in the station wagon. So that's sort of like our family myth, I think, that sustains that, we survived a tornado when I was an infant. But subsequently, at the time, though, living in a place with lovely but boring weather, I would be exposed to weather around the rest of the world through something called National Geographic magazine. Bit of foreshadowing there, right? And in about 1973, 74, there was an article in National Geographic magazine that changed my life. It was all about the great storms, and they were all seemed to be centered in North America, east coast of the United States. And I had pictures of Hurricane Betsy slamming Miami in 1965, and then tornadoes forming in Salina, Kansas. Where's Kansas? I had to go and look up on the map. So the bug was planted then, when I was a child. And then I went to the library and I could not read up enough. I quickly read through every source book I could on these subjects. My family immigrated to the United States. In the 70s, I was, it was like, going to Vegas in that sense. This is where the great storms happened. And sure enough, our first winter here, we had one of the great snowstorms in 1979, so-called President's Day storm. And it was amazing. So I was obviously hooked. But there was a really weird thing. I was absolutely mesmerized and fascinated by the weather, and none of my peers were. I was all alone in this hobby, if you would, fascination with storms. But it wasn't like today when you could just go on the internet and find out other people. I knew no one. So I had this very focused, autonomous hobby. And but the tornado fascination became something of I wouldn't say an obsession, but I just, they're such terrifying but mesmerizing things all at once. So if you're if you catch the bug as a kid, you're going to keep it, I'm sure. And no doubt today there are many more young people who get inspired this way because of things like YouTube. They can see these incredible videos. It shows up on the evening news, and there's unbelievable footage within minutes of a storm actually occurring. And indeed, storms are live streamed now, even from all the storm chasers out there. So yeah, that's how it came about. But then, the local angle and studying tornadoes in the Hudson Valley region itself, that's something I developed once I was sort of already maturing as a scientist. And that fascination continues as well.
That's great. Thank you. So we commissioned a report last January. We call it the Fernleaf Climate Primer. And we've actually forwarded that to all of you. Hopefully you've seen that in your emails, and we encourage everybody to take a look at it. But that was really our attempt to gather all of the available data sets on climate and its impact in our region. Of course, Anton, you've seen this. And so the idea is to look at all of the stressors and hazards, temperature variability, the growing season, et cetera. I'm just wondering, Anton, you've been looking at this again for decades in this region. What else are you seeing beyond the storms? What's notable to you?
Okay, well, first off, I'll plug that it's a great idea for everyone to open up that Greenleaf report when they can, because it's the way I see it, it's a very valuable contribution in trying to relate something which is relatively abstract and global in scale, and really make it understandable in terms of the local context. That's important. That said, it's not a technical report. They don't go into great depth. It's not put together by scientists, from what I can tell. They're rather people who really know how to consolidate information and make it understandable, in that light. So I think that's very useful. And this type of communication is helping fill a nexus that exists between what, say, the science community is generating and able to provide, but then what the public has accessible and in a very comprehensible format. So, the things that I'm seeing, some of the things are absolutely covered in the report, the changing seasonality, as we call it. The fact that the warm season, is lengthening at the expense of the cold season. The leaf out in the spring is occurring several weeks earlier now than it did, say, 100 years ago. And this is actually quantifiable. We actually have measurements of that. Similarly, the leaf drop being later and later. It's kind of remarkable. I lived in Nyack for years down in Rockland County, right by the old Tappan Zee Bridge. And, our neighbor sent us a video last year of the leaf drop that was happening. As it was happening, it's just a short video, on the 27th of November. That's crazy. 27th of November, after Thanksgiving. That's when the leaves are falling from the trees there. And, when I was in high school, this is a really interesting anecdote. Halloween involved, walking around the neighborhood, dressing up and, doing all the trick-or-treating and kicking all the piles of leaves of the roadside with the other kids and, getting thrown into those piles of leaves because the leaf drop had already happened by Halloween, 31st of October. Well, I think would be a great project for any high school kid. You want to take it on? Go to your local library or wherever there's a local newspaper that serves your community. Every year, they're going to have some kind of pictorial of the kids trick-or-treating on the 31st of October. See if you can go back several decades and, if they've got those newspapers archived, and look at pictures from Halloween's past and then Halloween's present, and see if what I'm describing is actually discernible in those pictures. That are there leaves on the trees today, but there never used to be leaves on the trees like I'm seeing? I think it would be a really interesting citizen science project to do something like this, because it's just so recognizable. You can see things like that. We also see strange asynchronies. Let's see, a couple of weeks ago, we had a prolonged warm spell, very mild, kind of an early January thaw. January thaws are not that uncommon. What I think was uncommon is the fact that Tracy and I pulled 3 ticks off our dog on the, in the first week of January, ticks in January, and we're at high elevation here in Columbia County. This is very, very strange. The fact that ticks could be active. And that was just a week after it had been 4 below zero in that Christmas time cold snap. So there's some really wild things going on. And, some of the changes are very slight and incremental, and other things are kind of dramatic. What is climate change? What is just some kind of natural variability? It's very hard to separate the two. But when you keep seeing things recurring, getting more severe, more odd, the message is received. Obviously changes are happening.
Great, thank you. Another thing the Fernleaf primer reports on is the projection that within the next 10 years, all of the counties within the Hudson River Valley will experience more than 10 days where the maximum temperature is above 90 degrees, which is an increase. Oh, hold on a second. Somebody's phoning me. I want to stop that. Sorry. I don't know what's, there we go. So anyway, we know within 10 years, 10 degrees, and yet by the end of the century, in Orange County, they're saying there'll be more than 80 days above 90 degrees, according to sort of the maximum projections. That's almost a quarter of the year above 90 degrees. Westchester's not far behind at 78 days. So can you tell us how this kind of weather will impact the storm patterns when we have that much heat?
Yeah, the building heat is inevitable. We are committed to it just by the buildup of greenhouse gases. And it would take some kind of semi-miraculous event, a natural event, to reverse it, i.e. in the form of a barrage of volcanic eruptions around the world that could put a veil of dust high up in the atmosphere that would reflect incoming sunlight. That, we do about once every couple of decades, you'll get a major volcanic eruption that actually can cool the climate a bit like this. But the problem is the dust all comes in sediments out of the atmosphere within about 2 years, and we got right back where we would have been otherwise. So barring some kind of intervention like that, and the plans afoot, and for humans to try to mimic what volcanoes do and that kind of thing, topic for another discussion. Intensified heat is just something we're going to have to live with. You can lament all you want, but that's the reality. And it will be experienced, everywhere and in varying degrees. The best refuge from that we have locally is to go uphill. It gets cooler by about 5.5 degrees per 1,000 feet as you go uphill on average on a summer afternoon. And indeed, up on here on our mountaintop, we can be 12 degrees cooler than Albany, which is near sea level, on a summer afternoon, which is great. The problem is there's only limited terrain at high elevations, and much of it is like protected forest and that type of thing. It's not that, you can move masses of people there. So yeah, this is obviously a concern, but in terms of the storminess, there's something very important to comprehend. There's absolutely a reason to believe that the impacts from storms, thunderstorms in particular, are going to become much, much more severe as the temperature increases, just because of a physical property of the atmosphere. It's got a very clunking name, the Clausius-Clapeyron relation. Don't need to memorize that, but what you should memorize is the following. That as temperature increases in a linear sense, like 1, 2, 3 degrees, the carrying capacity of the atmosphere to hold moisture increases about 7% per degree centigrade. That's 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So and that's an exponential increase. So as temperatures increase kind of in that linear fashion, moisture carrying capacity goes up crazily through the roof, all right? And what that means is that a typical summertime downpour say late in the century, will be able to deliver much more water, much more torrential rainfall in a short period of time than a storm at present will do, and much, much more than a storm, say, 100 years ago would have done. I mean, we've already had significant warming. That is a physical property of the atmosphere. It's not an opinion or anything like that. It's a very well-known physical property. So as the climate warms, what the average thunderstorm will be able to deliver in a short period of time will proportionally increase if you have a thunderstorm occurring in a warmer air mass. And then the most extreme thunderstorms, the worst storm of the year, will be so much worse than what we had in past experience. Well, why is this significant? Let's think about, say, engineering. Let's think about, the plumbing, the drainage ducts, the drainage, culverts under, roads that are everywhere, things like that. These are engineered with expectations of certain levels of water flow, okay? And those are based on historical precedents. What we expect in a return interval of maybe over 100 years, what the worst downpour would be like, how much water has to squeeze through that culvert, under that bridge, whatever. Those are engineered for the past. They're not engineered for the future. This is a simple physical property that we have to adjust to. And it's one of the most important take-home messages from climate change science. And I think it's one of the least comprehended by the general public as well. So really understanding that is, I think, hugely important. You'll simply see that the hydrological cycle, the water cycle, is kind of going to be intensified just by having a warmer atmosphere in which things take place. So that's, I think, the most important take-home message. So expect things like much more severe flash floods, much more frequently occurring. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing significant landslides starting to occur on steep slope terrain. The whole east wall of the Catskills, for example, we don't think of it as landsliding terrain, but maybe, we will start overcoming some of the natural defenses that we have, the capacity for the trees and the slopes to take on a lot of water in a short amount of time may eventually be overcome by things like that. These are things to watch out for as we progress.
That's great. Thank you. And I appreciate that, just to kind of understanding some of the science behind this, even though most of us on this call are lay people, not all of us. It's just helpful to get that in, and thank you for explaining it in a way that at least I can understand it. And so I guess related to that, so we have these huge water events, and then we have these extremes. I mean, last year we had serious drought that led to water restrictions in several of our communities here. And then we have those harmful algae blooms as a result of that in the Wallkill and the Rondout Creek and over in Ulster County. And then this crazy flooding. How can there be so much variation in one year? And is there anything we can extrapolate from that to look into the future?
Okay, let's revisit that awfully named Clausius-Clapeyron relation. Okay, as the temperatures increase, you have, extended spells of very, very warm weather. It's not just that water can be delivered from the atmosphere much faster than in the past, but water will be taken up into the atmosphere through evaporation more rapidly. A warmer atmosphere can evaporate more water, and effectively it sucks it out of vegetation as well. So I'll share an anecdote from this past summer. I mentioned that, we take this walk every day, the same patch of forest, and we see things. Well, June into early July was a pretty wet period up here. Everything was wonderfully lush. All the trees were in full leaf, ferns growing in the forest and everything. Then we had a 3-week dry spell in August, probably the same dry spell you're talking about, a mini drought. Okay, and parts of New England got into pretty severe drought for a while. Well, it was amazing in that 3-week period, the vegetation absolutely desiccated. So much so that on our familiar walk, the trees lost their leaves and all the ferns died. By the end of August, it looked barren. It looked sort of like winter in this patch of forest. Now, down in the valleys, the moisture was retained better, but up on the mountaintop, the moisture just got sucked out of the landscape. The leaf litter was bone dry. And to be honest, there was a fire hazard. If fire from a lightning strike or something like that could conceivably spread. And that's something I think we will be dealing with in the future, is that the propensity of forests, obviously there's a huge amount of latent fuel present in the forest here, but as long as the forest is moist, we don't have a forest fire problem. When you get dry spells like this, which are going to be intensifying, it does raise the prospect of significant forest fires in places that we don't really see them, or at least we're not accustomed to seeing them. Obviously, they've happened in the past. From here on my hilltop, I look over the next hilltop's BB Hill, and there's a fire tower up there that's been there for 100 years. Well, they put that fire tower up there for some reason. Clearly, there was a problem in the past from forest fires, but we don't really think of it that much as being, significant. Well, to follow on what happened with our patch of local forest, it dried out, the leaves fell, the ferns died, then the rains returned in September. The leaves grew back on the trees, but now they had this weird asynchrony. You're not meant to be getting new leaf growth this late in the season in September, when in October they immediately came down off the trees again. So this is probably starting to have some kind of effect as well on how trees are growing and other, I'm not sure what the consequences are. I'm not a biologist, but it's really interesting to see these things and to ask questions about them. And it's a bit alarming. So yeah, the take-home message, it's not just that water can be delivered from the atmosphere more rapidly than in the past, but water gets taken out of the landscape. Now, if you want to see this in full swing, watch California over the next 6 months. Okay, California, of course, has this huge propensity to burn in the warm time of the year. And that they've been blaming, well, it's recurrent droughts. Well, they've just had near record rainfall in California over the last month. What that's going to do is result in a massive sort of bloom of vegetation everywhere, which is going to dry out incredibly fast as we go into the dry season, because it's probably going to be another very hot summer out west. And that raises the prospect of even worse wildfires than we've been seeing down the line, maybe in the latter half of this year. Sorry to be doom and gloom, but that's the reality that we look at. Yeah.
No, actually, I know some of this stuff is hard to hear. Certainly our mission at Partners for Climate Action is to take action, to encourage everybody in the region to do something. There's work that we can be doing to mitigate. There's also work we can be doing to adapt to what's just our reality. And so my question, you've given us some suggestions, just looking at things like our civil engineering and preparing for bridges and roadways that can withstand what's happening. I'm wondering, if you have recommendations for our municipalities. We have several elected officials on the call, and just those of us who are working in our towns as volunteers on climate committees and other groups. How do you think municipalities in our bioregion, and perhaps especially along the Hudson River, should be thinking about resiliency and planning to address future climate impacts?
Very expensive question. The first thing to do is accept the inevitability of change, all right? And stop using historical analogs to try to anticipate what the future will bring. The worst flood from 100 years ago is not useful as for comparing, saying what we should be engineering for today. You can take the city of Houston which can be the poster child for this kind of flawed thinking. All right, Houston, the 4th largest municipality, I think, in the United States these days. Huge city and very flat terrain. Okay. Prone to large magnitude rainfalls. Well, there's something called the 500-year flood, which is kind of meant to be the worst case scenario, the worst flood you'd expect in a 500-year period. And so if you're being very cautious when you engineer structures, you would take that 500-year flood into account. And that's based on the statistics of, all the rainfall events going back as long as you have a weather station, a rain gauge making observations, say, in that area. Well, Houston has now had about 4 500-year floods in the last 20 years. Okay, supposed 500-year floods. Because the 500-year flood is not a 500-year flood anymore. It's a 5-year flood. It occurs that much more frequently. And, this is costing, hundreds of billions of dollars. The entire city needs to be re-engineered. And one of the things I've discovered is that basically the city is located in a terribly bad place from a flooding perspective. Well, how do you move millions of people out of there? And that's not going to happen. You simply have to start adapting it in different ways. So in the Hudson Valley, we're kind of lucky because there are not that many areas. The Hudson River itself is obviously at sea level. That sea level is rising. How much is it rising? 3 millimeters a year, something like that. 3 millimeters is very small. You look at it, that much. But 10 years, it's that much. 100 years, it's that much. But the thing is, it's also likely to be accelerating in terms of the rate of increase. We know that as ice is melting and then the polar regions raising sea levels this way. We're not going to stop that. We have to accept that it's going to happen. There's not that much built infrastructure that is vulnerable in the short term, say in the next 2 or 3 decades, to those changes in sea level rise. Yeah, unlike, say, most of the state of Florida, okay, where small changes in sea level rise have huge impacts because most of Florida is very, very low level and prone, of course, to things like hurricanes that temporarily raise sea levels enormously. But the combination of the rising water levels of the river itself, and then a far greater concern to me is what will come flooding down on every water course when you have intense summer thunderstorms. Those things are, when a bridge is damaged, don't just fix the bridge. You have to fix the bridge for future conditions anticipated. You have to do the expensive fix that is so much more robust than what existed before. Nobody likes to hear that, okay? Yes, it means taxes. A climate tax is a concept that maybe we must get familiar with. That things are going to cost more to engineer more robustly, the money's going to have to come from somewhere. So we just have to be thinking this way. In some ways, maybe think of it, we're all beneficiaries of the hydrocarbon consumption that has resulted in the problem. It's incredibly convenient to just get in the car and drive somewhere, but the cost we pay for that is the emissions to the atmosphere. And those emissions to the atmosphere are having a discernible change. So it's not like we're suddenly having to bear the burden and, none of us are responsible for it. Sad to say we are all responsible for it. And let's just recognize that.
Okay, I have one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Joshua, who I know has been looking at the chat to see questions from our group. My last question is, do you have any recommendations on how to keep up to date on the latest science on climate change and how the best way to track current storm events? Okay,
I have provided a few links, which I think was circulated in the emails accompanying this announcement for those interested, but there's much more I can add as well. How to stay abreast of climate science, on climate change can be challenging because there's a great deal of information out there, and there's almost an equal amount of misinformation out there, unfortunately, these days. As soon as things get tied to political agendas or personal agendas, what have you, truth may go out the window. And that is a challenge we inevitably face, not just on subjects like climate change. So I go to the most authoritative sources I can, but at the same time, you also want to go to something which is comprehensible, not written in such technical language that it becomes very difficult to grasp really what the messaging is. There are increasingly some really good resources out there in major media. Major media has woken up to the reality that this is the most important story of the 21st century. Okay, the Washington Post, for example, now has, I believe, 60 journalists and related people working on climate. Okay, which is a substantial fraction of all the journalists in that organization. The New York Times climate desk is probably of similar size these days as well. these are really good go-to sources that I follow, because their reportage tends to be rigorous. They try to get it right. They don't always get it right. Sometimes things are overhyped or underhyped, in my opinion. But I'm a climate scientist. Of course, I'm going to have opinions on things like that. But if you want to stay abreast of things, those are two excellent sources. There's a group called Yale Climate 360. As well, from out of Yale University, an affiliated NGO, if you would, has great journalism, and there are various sources like that out there. Be cautious when it comes to sort of, some story which is telling you, it looks like they're trying to inflate everything or over sensationalize things. If in doubt, if some stories got you staying awake at night, go and say how the Washington Post reported on that same topic. You'll probably get a more judicious telling, which I think is useful. Now, the US government has fantastic resources. The NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I can't plug them enough because they generate many of the observations and the fundamental work which so much of this reportage is about. So NOAA has a unified resource, climate.gov, on the internet, with fantastic graphics, very up to date, very good explanatory stuff. You could start there, you'd be in good shape as well, if you really want to kind of see what the science is saying. Another way to follow things is find some of these very good science journalists. You can follow their Twitter feeds or blog postings. And they really strive to explain things and make them understandable.
And what are some of their names?
Bob Henson, good friend. He was a former communications director for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He occasionally has posts on the Washington Post website, and he's also with the Yale Climate Group, I think. So Bob Henson, just look up Bob Henson Twitter, you'll find him. There's a whole host of scientists. If you want to follow California, which is really interesting, the fire and flood situation, the scientist named Daniel Swain, S-W-A-I-N, really, really good. I'd have to come up with a list and I could circulate that as well. But just as a couple of examples, start with Bob Henson, you'd be in good shape. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. I noticed too, Martin Ping popped into the chat, the website for the Farmscape Ecology Program at Hudson Valley. They've been looking at local phenology for years, and their website is here, hvfarmscape.org. It's another one to add to the list. So great. Well, Anton, thank you for letting me ask my questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Joshua to point out what's in the chat and send some questions your way.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. We have about 15 minutes to the end of the session, and we have several questions, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. And Anton, you just mentioned flooding in California, so I'll start with Avalon's question, in which she references flooding. So she's wondering how scientists decide to officially relate extreme weather events to climate impacts or not, like floods in California. Is it all based on historical record? What other modeling or other tools are there to make connections between weather and climate? And you spoke a bit about this, but if you have anything to add.
Yeah, it's tremendous advances have been made in the last few years through what they call extreme attribution science. Okay. Google that term. There's probably an excellent Wikipedia page, I guess, on extreme attribution science these days. And what this is it asks the question, did climate change, human-induced climate change, because of things like greenhouse gas emissions, did human-induced climate change make a particular event worse? Okay. Is there an augmentation aspect? We do not expect that a buildup of greenhouse gases is going to cause an event, cause the floods in California. The floods in California occur because of circulations of the atmosphere, a barrage of storms lining up in the Pacific Ocean coming on shore in rapid succession. And in aggregate, you get a major flooding event like this, okay? Well, the question is, absent greenhouse gas buildup in the atmosphere, would the California floods have been as severe as they were? That's the right question to be asking. And so what extreme attribution science does, which is really, really interesting, it takes advantage of massive computational power we have these days, supercomputers, okay? And they run simulations of this event under the conditions today, and then they have multiple simulations as well under conditions of the past, when you had like a cooler atmosphere, if you would, with different greenhouse gas levels and things like that. And then they look at the difference of the results to say, well, if the same atmospheric circulations had occurred in the past, lining up for California, would the outcome have been the same? Okay, we do this with heat waves. We do this with some individual flooding events. They can even do it with, individual hurricanes, in the sense of saying, is there evidence that this hurricane, is worse today because the water temperatures, the ocean temperatures that fuel the hurricane are elevated? And you can actually start putting some numbers on the likelihood that it was more severe, because of climate change, and even, what that magnitude increase is about. And this extreme attribution science is incredibly informative because, think of it in this political sphere. Politicians don't want to do anything, okay? Because it's very, very difficult to do things, to make change. And oftentimes it's very expensive to make changes. So it's much easier if you're a politician to say, well, that's nature doing its thing. Maybe it's climate change, but we'll never know. Well, along comes the extreme attribution scientists saying, actually, there's a 78% likelihood that we did make it worse. What are you going to do? Because 5 years from now, a similar storm, we would be able to say there was an 88% likelihood it was worse like that, okay? And it actually starts putting the onus on the polity to do something about things, because we can actually give a sense of attribution. And another thing which is really interesting, you can start understanding the cost burden of climate change. You can really see it in terms of damages. Well, who pays for that? Who are the big polluters? Who are the big emitters and all that kind of stuff? I mean, we all are, as I was talking about earlier, to some degree, but certainly there are industries, there are countries that are far worse than others. So this is where the sense of that carbon tax sort of starts creeping in, and the sense of covering the costs of these things. It's very important. So again, the field's called extreme attribution science. There are papers that are coming out almost every week. And one of the really interesting things is a group of scientists got together kind of as an ad hoc committee, and they tackle events as they happen. And within about 3 weeks of some major newsworthy story, they've run their simulations and they publish their results. They tell you what happened. This type of thing gets coverage these days in, those websites I talked about, like, Capital Weather Gang and the Washington Post, well worth looking at. So I'm sure we'll start seeing reports coming out very soon talking about the California floods in this light.
Okay, thanks, Anton. So Anna asked a question about a specific climate model. She's wondering what the best climate model to calculate changes in the probability of extreme events of future rainfall for this region would be. And she's asking specifically about the REMO 2015, REMO 2015 model, if you're familiar.
Okay. A model from 2015 is obsolete today. It's strange, but it's, which is not to say that it's invalid. It's just that there are, modeling, atmospheric modeling is quite extraordinary in how it's advanced. And largely that ties to the advances in computational power, which is unbelievable. About every 18 months, computers, double in their capacity. And, we certainly see that, the kind of simulations we have. That said, it seems that we're about to go where we are going through a breakthrough in what modeling can do in terms of computational power, because of something called graphic processing units, which is something which come out of computer games, believe it or not. But it's been demonstrated that, typically say to run a global atmospheric model, if you want to say run a 10-day simulation of the atmosphere, it takes several hours to run this. The major modeling centers around the world are using some of the most powerful supercomputers. Some of these newer computers that are being tested using graphical things do this in a fraction of a second. A 10-day outlook in a fraction of a second for the entire world. I can't get my head around how this is feasible, okay? But this is what's happening, okay? So expects perhaps, that cliched quantum leap in computational power is starting to emerge right now. Again, a topic you should get a computer scientist who works in this field on here to talk about it more. I'm not the right person to discuss it, but this is something to track over time. But what I would look for, say, for the Hudson Valley region, there's a huge effort that takes place about every 7 years among the modeling centers around the world to kind of unify the results so that can all be compared. It's called the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, CMIP. And these are the predictions that are then used to inform the IPCC reports, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the authoritative UN, United Nations body on climate change, making very clear, coherent statements. About every 7 years, a new report comes out. It's based on sort of the state of the science, vast things. This is done globally, but it does break things down by sub-regions. Not so much, the Northeast United States may be a sub-region, not the Hudson Valley within. But that is, the one thing to shy away from is the use of a single model versus looking at what a variety of models show and then getting a sense of the distribution of outcomes that those models show. That is actually more powerful than any individual one. The other problem with models is you don't know that they're accurate until some point in the future, right? Or how accurate they are. Can we wait 50 years to find out that the REMA model really was the best one? Okay. Of course, it's projections. And so, we also always want to have things that are very high resolution, very focused and local, but that doesn't necessarily actually increase accuracy. It makes things maybe more understandable, and so I'm trying to understand the types of changes we get. So there's a lot of nuance here. And if somebody says they've got the best model, for some particular purpose, I'm like, well, maybe for an event, yes. Like which weather model called our storm yesterday the best? Okay, that same weather model may do a terrible job on the storm that's coming tomorrow night. There's a spectrum of outcomes.
Great, thank you. So you spoke earlier about planning and resiliency, and we have a question here from Dan about watersheds. So he's interested in learning sort of how to communicate to communities, particularly as it relates to drinking water sources, that extreme rainfall events are likely. We've seen intense storms, tropical systems, also nor'easters that have dumped 5 to 7 inches in a short period of time in certain spots. These can have significant short-term and long-term consequences for water quality supply. However, he doesn't know whether it's accurate to say that we should all prepare for such storms or if they're going to track in certain areas within our watershed. Can you offer any guidance on approaching that issue?
Very interesting question. If you get your water source from a well, nature offers great filtration. Before the water enters your well, a certain level of filtration is occurring as percolation occurs through the soil and down to that level of your water table. If you get your water, however, from a water course, from a natural stream or river or a reservoir, that's prone to increased siltation, increased sediment load coming down from more intense rainfall events. That just makes sense. Now, that won't characterize the average rainfall event, but certainly for those high-level ones, certainly after a major heavy rainfall event, you'll see the Hudson River goes brown. You can see there's much more turbidity and much more mud that's mixed in there. And it takes a while for that to sediment out and to settle down. So yeah, that is a concern for the future. And, you know, some of the filtration systems that we have may become overwhelmed over time and have to be re-engineered to take a greater sediment load as these things happen. Again, I don't think this would characterize the average storm, but for the exceptional storm, there may be periods where we see water advisories, don't drink the water, you know, because there's too much stuff in there, too much material. And it can also, you know, there's a history of industrialization of the Northeast. And there's down in those sediments at the bottom of rivers, there can be some very nasty chemicals from, you know, prior factories and things like that, that as long as they stay buried in sediment, it's not a problem. Well, if a very strong current comes down, an exceptional flood scours out that sediment, you've got a problem, right? So that's, again, another type of concern that we may increasingly face over time. Best to acknowledge it's going to happen, and then you can do studies to try to understand which water courses have the greatest propensity for this type of activity, and which, you know, what's plan B as a water supply in case, you know, it becomes unpotable over time.
Great, thank you. We're just about at the end of our time together. I'm going to ask you one last question. It might be a bigger question than we have time for, so try your best if you don't mind. And then hopefully we can share some of the other questions that are in the chat with you, if you don't mind indulging us and helping us sort of respond to those, and we can send those out after as well. But we have one from Mana Jo. She says, with poles warming, ice melting, methane release from permafrost, what tipping points are we approaching or have passed? If we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, will that be sufficient to restore climate balance? Are there real solutions available? You got 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, a very, very difficult and unpalatable question. Unquestionably, we've passed some tipping points already with the climate system. You know, I mean, Arctic sea ice, you know, it may be doomed. I'm not sure how we keep the remainder of the sea ice. You know, in the summertime, the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free in the future. It's a question of, do we get there in 5 years or 20 years? Again, it's, you know, and there are huge consequences for that. And there's also kind of, you know, a feedback. You know, if you don't have ice to reflect sunlight, that sunlight then goes into the water and adds to the warming, and other things, you know, start happening. So yeah, there are many concerns like that. And the whole question of tipping points, things that, you know, you cross a line and it's very hard then to get back where you were. Even if we were to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, okay, back to an acceptable level. Don't know how it happens, you know, but if that was to happen, there's so much inertia in the climate system. It would take many decades, I think, before we would slow down the juggernaut, okay? You know, we've warmed the oceans, we'll continue to warm the oceans, and that's a huge storehouse of heat, okay? So then even if the atmosphere starts to then sort of come back down in temperature, having those warmer oceans is enormously problematic, because let's say if the temperature does come down, you start changing something called the atmospheric instability, okay? Which is that when you have very cold air over very warm water, that fuels explosive storm development, all right? And you know, it's a whole hornet's nest of changes, of things that we don't really want to see, you know, in the future. So slowing down the juggernaut, I'm not sure how it happens, but we have to try. And we have to sort of ramp things down the best way we can. But yeah, we're already committed to an enormous amount of change. It's unquestionable. And we just have to live with it and adapt. That's the message.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of this and for sharing your insights with us, and for all of you for being here. I'll just wrap up by pitching our next 2 morning coffee sessions. Our next one is going to be on February 14th, which is Valentine's Day. And that one will be focused on lessons from Poughkeepsie. It's about municipal climate policy approaches to community choice aggregation, historic preservation, and waterfront development. And then the following month, we have one on March 14th, and that's about how to build a successful climate neutral business with CEO Nels Leader of Bread Alone Bakery, who will share their story. So I hope you'll join us for those. Thanks again, Anton. Thank you, Bob. Thank you all for being here with us today.
Thanks,
good-
everyone.